maps out. Once again, you'll orient the Confederate to the high ground. Remember, these are two islands. Directly in front of us is Thoburn's Island. The island to your right with the driftwood and logs filled up there from the southern point is Parker's Island. Now, slightly down, a few hundred yards farther downstream, is an anomaly in the Shenandoah River known as Parker's Hole. You can walk across here. You can see there was actually a middle ford that went right out to that island and then on over to the other side. Parker's Ford was probably right opposite, just right opposite. There's a little stream that empties into the river. It's down in that vicinity. And it's going to come into play here, but it's a real deep spot in the river. And keep in mind that most soldiers, even where there's not fords, it's not very deep in most of the areas you could walk across, and your head's not going to be underwater. Now, I'm going to point out here in terms of the battlefield, you look over to the right front, what you've got here is the channels between the two rivers, and what it allows us to do, it gives us a clear view shed. It may not if we're here in June and July, but right now it does because the leaves are just starting to poke through. And what you have out there is the main part of the right flank of the main battlefield. Out there in that area is Young's dismounted cavalrymen. Right down here across from us behind this island is the 4th West Virginia, which is Lieutenant Colonel Vance. Eli's Brigade, which consists of a couple Maryland Home Guard type units, 2nd Potomac Home Brigade and 2nd Eastern Shore, the 18th Connecticut, 54th Pennsylvania, and then you could go on, you've got Frost Brigade, which is 4 West Virginians, and then Wells Brigade down at the far end of the line that we discussed before. So, initial things that happen is that skirmish line is going to get driven back right on top of the Union battle line. Now, one of the things here, when you're looking across there and you look into the distance, what you see is ultimately going up to the high ground where the Confederate battle lines are shown and what they're going to come over when they launch their attack. But it's kind of deceiving because part of that's going to drop back down and there's a series of weathered knolls, probably about 75 yards to 100 yards from where the true western bank of the river is. And it's going to be on that series of knolls where Thoburn's battle line is going to be in position. Now, if you look off beyond that field, you can barely make out through the trees another tree line that's running perpendicular and up the river. And that's generally, if you see Roads Run on your map, that's generally the area where Roads Run is flowing down. And that kind of defines the combat area of the Battle of Cool Spring. It's Roads Run on this flank, all the way down to where Cool Spring flows in on the left flank of Wells, where we were at our first stop here on the battlefield. So the first thing that's happening is these skirmishers coming forward. Now, this pressure is going to be especially severe from in front of Rhodes divisions, because the Army of Northern Virginia divisions, they have organized corps of sharpshooters. And we'll be seeing them this afternoon as well, and tomorrow, and Saturday at Charlestown as well. But what they did is the best shots that they would compose from a division, all of the regiments and brigades, the men would come together, and they were chosen because they were the best shots. And they didn't have any special rifles, Whitworths. It may have been a handful of those. But these men would be out in front, and they were the best shots. They were probably all the best hunters back home in their county. And so this division of 3,000 men of Rhodes probably had about 300 of these guys. And they always came out in front. And many times in these engagements, Union forces are thinking they are engaged with a line of battle. Colonel Joseph Thoburn later commented in his diary about the effectiveness of the Southern sharpshooters. And he complained, such a body is not known within our force, being Crook's little Army of West Virginia. So they just more, hey, Company C, you're on skirmish duty today. But anyway, those skirmishers are going to be the first pressure that they feel from Robert Roads by about 5 o'clock coming down on their right flank. And behind them is going to be the line of battle. Attacking on the extreme right and almost getting square against the Union right flank is going to be the Alabama Brigade. Normally under the command of Brigadier General Cullen Battle. Today, because of his Battle is recovering from wounds earlier in the campaign, it's under the command of a Colonel Samuel Pickens. Pickens' men are going to come in and take position behind a stone wall at the far edge of that field and open fire into the flank. The initial Union Confederate troops of Rhodes are going to stop up on the top of that upland ridge at the edge of a wooded lot that was there, and they will open fire without advancing initially. What's going to happen is the dismounted cavalrymen are going to panic. They are going to retreat, most of them. Give you a little description. Colonel Robert S. Rogers, commander of the 2nd Maryland Eastern Shore Regiment, which is across there fighting. When he came across, he saw a squad of these men. Their feet were all beat up, and they were, in the interim period, they were sitting at the edge of the river. They've taken off their big cavalry boots, and they're soothing their blistered, aching feet in the cool mud along the bank of the Shenandoah River before the fighting started. And Rogers kind of assessed these men and said when he saw that, he didn't have a lot of faith that this unit would stand, and it did not. Colonel Samuel Young's troops are going to retreat, most of them to that island. Now, remember, they don't cross here, so they're not too sure of where all the fords are at. They're going to go in a panic, and many of them are just going to plunge into the water through this channel, and they will hit Parker's Hole, and they will die. They will drown. I've talked to one person who's dove that, and it's at least 12 feet deep. And it's just like he said, you were just walking on the river, and then suddenly it's like a ledge that just drops straight down. So a man carrying a rifle, equipment, like even if he abandoned that on there, he's got his boots, those big boots, and uniform and belts and things, he's just going to sink right down. And you know, back in that day, not everybody's mom didn't take them for swimming lessons at the YW or YMCA when they were 5 years old. Lots of men would drown down in there. But that's going to expose that flank, and it's going to have a ripple effect down here. The 4th West Virginia is going to attempt to change front to meet that assault. But as they're doing that, the rest of Rhodes' division is going to join in the battle. Now, what's important to note on these battles is sometimes you can get carried away when you're doing these maps and put a lot of arrows in it. In this case, you're probably thinking that Gabriel Wharton is charging headlong in a line of battle like Rhodes had attacked. But Wharton is playing it cool. His main body is on the backside of the ridge, and his sharpshooters are up on the military crest, pressuring down in the area of Wells' brigade, in that on the left flank. So that's going to be important. Gordon's skirmishing with some troops down there. There's artillery duel down at the river crossing as well. When the North Carolinians, Georgians charge forward, they're essentially going to drive Thoburn back to the river. There's a panic going on. But by the time this happens, you know, we're talking, this is now about 6 o'clock in the afternoon, evening. Artillery is on that high ground up there, one. Ricketts and Crook and Wright have arrived here, and they're out here in this vicinity behind you in the floodplain. Again, you see a lot of undulations over there. Most of that is man-made obstacles and tees and bunkers and greens from the old golf course. This was relatively level floodplain, as it is on the other side of the river. And they will have a decision to make. You've got hundreds of men streaming back across the river in confusion. Ricketts assesses the situation. And what's he going to accomplish at this point now? With 2 Confederate divisions up there on the high ground, Thoburn's division pretty well defeated at this point, and men streaming across here already. Ricketts makes the decision that there's nothing he can accomplish. He starts trying to cross his men into the face of this chaotic retreat. And again, crossing a river is no easy matter, let alone doing it under fire. When you come out of the river over there, your men are going to be under fire right away from Confederate infantry as soon as they are attempting to deploy. And sadly, a decision is made by Ricketts that he can't do that. Crook would protest the rights, and Wright, you know, it's one of those tough decisions that military commanders have to make, because likely all that's sending Ricketts across at this point, because at this point Thoburn's trying to rally his men right along the riverbank across from us, those that did not retreat. Yeah, that's it. You know, he decides, we're not doing it, we can't do it. Crook and his men, many of them years after the war, you know, they would write of this, and they would hold Ricketts and Wright in disdain for failure to come to their aid. And you can understand that from them as the combat guys, but the situation was they were sacrificed, quite literally, and probably Ricketts' men would have added to the amount of the sacrifices about all they might have accomplished had they attempted to advance across into the midst of this cauldron of confusion and now let's get back to Colonel Joseph Thoburn and what he's done. Now, one of the key things, when they start forming lines behind that wall, and if you look right through this gap, you can see where that road was at. That's one of a lot of places over there, that road is kind of washed out, and the bank is right up against where the remains of the stone wall was. You can see that level platform. You go up about 6 feet from the river, and you'll see all that green area. That's where the road was. And then you have an embankment that's probably about 5 feet up from the road to the main farmland on the other side. At the top of that embankment, there was a stone wall. And to this day, along there, various portions of piles of rock remain from the stone wall that was there. These stone walls were built by the original farmers. They would clear their fields of the rock so they could plant over there, and then they would use that rock to build a wall along the edge of their field. So Thoburn, he had, even before he advanced, he kept one regiment under the command of Colonel William B. Curtis. Curtis has the 12th West Virginia Infantry. This is a Wheeling, West Virginia area unit. And they are in line of battle, probably right about just to our left front, behind that wall. They are going to form the nucleus of a line along the river to make a last stand. You know, a fight for literally for survival, to prevent yourself from being cut off and captured by the attacking Confederates atop of that ridge. A member of the 12th West Virginia writes home a couple days after the battle, and he talks about all the troops flying back in confusion. You know, you see they're at the higher ground. They're literally jumping over the 12th West Virginia men. He said they came down on us like an inundation and just kept going back across the river. He noted that many, many brave men stopped and fell in and fought with them. But as units, for the most part, they were gone and disorganized. Now, by this point in the battle, Colonel Thoburn is the only man mounted on a horse riding back and forth along his battle line. He's going to send orders down to Colonel Wells. Wells has the luxury that Gordon's not moving on his left, Warden is not pushing forward there, so he's going to get 2 regiments, actually 1 regiment, the 116th Ohio under Colonel James Washburn, and 5 companies, the 123rd Ohio, that weren't out on the skirmish line, and bring them forward. And they're going to arrive just in the nick of time. The 123rd Ohio as the line's collapsing and there's a big gap down in that direction into which Brigadier General William Cox's North Carolina Brigade is starting to charge down the hill. Those quad companies are going to spread out and open fire in front. As Cox is swinging around the attack, charge down the hill, the 34th Massachusetts on the right wing of Wells' brigade is going to open an enfilading fire into the right flank of Wells as he's attacking towards that line. And Cox's men are going to have to fall back in confusion. You see, what's happening here is now where Rhodes, when they drove him off of that first ridge, Rhodes had the advantage. Everybody was moving in concert. Now the follow-up attack is degenerating into a piecemeal assault. You'll have Owens, which is Grimes' brigade, attempting to attack. 12th West Virginia will fire and repel them with the assistance of other troops that have rallied on their right flank. Georgians, they take the least casualties and they seem to kind of hang back on the ridge and not make that deadly push against that wall position. The problem remains over in that vicinity is the Alabama Brigade under Pickens. Its men are already starting to get down in that area and filter down upstream along that road there. And just in the nick of time, Colonel Washburn's 116th Ohio, there's, I think, Kevin, you got an ancestor, 116, proud descendant back there. They are going to open fire and drive the Alabamans out of the road. They're going to fall back to this stone wall there, kind of the intersection of that stone wall. And so Colonel Washburn's going to go down with a ghastly wound. And the descriptions of it, it went in the eye and came out behind his ear. And his men will that evening back here on this side be visiting him in a medical tent. And they are going to be wishing him farewell. They think he's dead. He's going to show up and come visit them down in camps around Cedar Creek shortly after the Battle of Cedar Creek in the fall of 1864. He'll be blind with one eye, but he will live somehow. Wow. In his stead steps the capable Lieutenant Colonel, Irish-born Thomas Francis Wilds, and he's going to order men down, and they're going to sneak. They're going to crawl along the wall, a party of about a dozen men, till they get right opposite of that corner where the Alabamans are taking refuge, and they're going to pop over the fence and open fire at them in some very close range firing. The rest of the regiment will fire, and the Alabamans are going to fall back to safer territory. Now these units, Rhodes attempts to maneuver his units, but now this Union artillery behind you, Rhode Islanders and West Virginians, are going to dominate this battlefield. And any unit that attempts to move on that open, wide open ridge there is going to get pummeled. Confederate soldiers will talk about the impact of this. They will also talk about having to charge against what amounted to a natural trench, which you can see right across the river here, there, how the road gave that protection. So now evening's wearing on. Darkness has started to come over the battlefield. The situation is calming. There's some sporadic gunshots, artillery fire every now and then. Both sides are content to see. The Confederates, they're not sure what's going on. Colonel Thoburn is going to begin pulling his troops back, and he'll kind of leapfrog them, putting a unit on the island, and then marching another unit up, and then go from the island there, and he'd be covering the retreat from the island until finally all of the troops would be out of there. The last one to leave was the 4th West Virginia Infantry under Colonel Vance. And these West Virginians were proud soldiers. They had fought in the Vicksburg campaign and at Chattanooga, and they had their gusto up after making their stand over there. They wanted to stay all night, but Thoburn prudently said, we're out of here. And they're going to get over into the river. When the panic was on, there's stories of officers and men, Colonel Jacob Weddell of the 1st West Virginia Infantry this is all muddy, and they're wet coming out, and they start trying to come up this muddy bank here. And as more men come up to it, it's like a slip and slide, and men are going up. Weddell gets one of his epaulets shot off of the shoulders of his shirt from the Confederates firing from the high ground there. So there's many stories from these troops just struggling. Once you make it across alive here, you know, this bank isn't necessarily user-friendly in all places. So it was a struggle. But now, Jubal Early's down on the battlefield about this time. The battle lines are stagnant. What they don't know is what's going on with the Yankees down there. It's dark. They can't see. The last they saw, they were there. So there's going to be a couple of volunteers, Alabama soldiers. And they're going to volunteer and given the assignment. They're going to crawl down the hill, probably within sight, right over in that general area with Alabama. They're going to crawl down towards that entrenchment and that stone wall. And one of these guys wrote a little memoir about this. And his moment of truce, he gets there. He's right behind that stone wall. And, you know, because of the sunken nature of it, it's not like there's somebody standing up. If there's Yankees there, they're hunkered down right up beside that bank on the opposite side of where he is. So his moment of truth comes when he realizes he's got to raise up and look over there. Oh, boy. And he writes, he says, I didn't know but if I was going to get my head blown off or if the Yankees were going to be gone. Fortunately, all he saw was lanterns over here as they were helping soldiers out of the river. There would be some activity down in Gordon's area. Floyd King's artillery battalion would deploy in the evening. One of the artillerists wasn't very happy with John Gordon as he was arriving. Gordon made him take a real roundabout route to come in and deploy in front of Gordon's division and wasted a lot of time. But there might be some Confederate artillery went into position up on the high ground behind Rhodes' position. Now, casualties here, about 380 some Union troops are killed and wounded, few captured, a lot of missing. Missing were probably drowned soldiers here. Confederate losses, 398. There's a gentleman, I've always done casualty rosters and things and looking for casualties and things. There's a gentleman, he did a study on the Army of Northern Virginia casualties in the Overland Campaign. His name's Al Young, published by LSU Press probably 10 years ago now. He's doing Petersburg now and Valleys is next. And so he's updated this, and so he estimates about 390 Confederate casualties in making these assaults here at Cool Spring. You know, this is not one of the biggest names or biggest battles it was, but as one North Carolinian wrote, he said, where he stood, that was his hottest spot of the war. He was charging down the hill towards that stone wall. And one of the slang-talking West Virginians from Thoburn's force called it, quote, a right smart little fight here. They would fall back, hold their ground overnight. July the 19th, two armies licked their wounds. The Confederates would hastily bury the dead on the other side. And Wright's over here figuring out what he's going to do. And he determines he's going to march about 6 miles north of here to Keys Ferry and come around the area. That's where Route 9 essentially comes over the mountains and goes into Charlestown. That plan's going to quickly fall by the wayside in this development. While this fighting is going on here on the 18th, David Hunter, ironically, who had kind of been shelved and told to go make your headquarters in an office anywhere you choose, you know, Harper's Ferry, Martinsburg, he's going to start sending troops down as they arrive from their circuitous retreat to the Ohio River and on the B&O Railroad, which takes time because Early tore up good stretches of 40 miles of it, from, you know, west of Martinsburg all the way to Point Lookout. Thank you. And so when they arrived, the troops that arrive at Harper's Ferry, next is Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes' brigade of Ohioans. And on the 18th, they're going to get started to march southward out of Charlestown. And the goal is they're going to come in on Early's northern flank while the engagement is coming. Because George Crook, when he got his orders, to move out and cross the river and attack if practical from Wright, he sends a message to to Hunter early on the morning of the 18th before the battle that says, I'm moving to Snickers Gap and attacking the enemy this morning, so that Hunter knows what's going on. So Hunter's sending Hayes out, and we're going to follow Hayes' route, and he's going to have a small engagement with Confederate cavalry that we'll point out to you from the bus. But he's not going to make it down very far. He's going to halt on the 18th. He hears the artillery fire down here at Snickers Gap, but he can tell from the fire, it doesn't sound like there's any progress. That the artillery fire is not getting closer to him, which he thought it would if the Union troops were successful down here at Snickers Gap. And he will have a combat the next day on the 19th there. Hunter will also be sending William Woods Averill, the small force of cavalry and infantry, south from Martinsburg on the 19th, pressing towards Winchester. Jubal Early is feeling this pressure on his left flank, and on the 19th, Dufier's division is going to show up, again, 9 miles as the crow flies south from here, and attempt to cross the river down at Berry's Ferry. So he's now got Union troops on both his flanks. And although old Jube would have loved to have stayed and harvest all the summer wheat that was ripe in the fields, he had to pull back to Fisher's Hill. And we'll pick up from there. But again, big picture consequence here. Jubal Early, successful rear guard action. Wright and Crook fail in their plan to flank Gordon and, make short work of what they considered was a relatively small rear guard action. Mike.
The actual battle, this is the island, right? This is the third floor, this is the island. It was no trees on it, right?
No, there's some trees on these islands, yes.
But the battle, you can't see it.
You can't see it. Again, the question is like the exact location. In front of you is the island. And you can't see, there's another, it goes down, and then there's another small channel that in some places is, maybe only 20 feet wide. Sometimes when it's dry, even wet. And that's monastery property. When you look up through the gap there, you can see where that other channel starts to go behind the lettuce. So it's much more distant over to the Union position there. We take a couple more questions before we start headed back to the bus.
Question, was Wharton under any orders to maintain his position and not bring on a general engagement, or I got the impression that Rhodes kind of acted on his own?
Well, he does. Remember, I mentioned earlier that the question is, does Gordon what were Gordon's orders, and does Rhodes act on his own?
No, not Gordon, Wharton.
Wharton.
Yeah. Wharton seems to have only sent out skirmishers. He could have easily crushed the left flank had he advanced. Why didn't he advance?
Well, here's the first question is about Wharton. Why doesn't Wharton advance? So Wharton has artillery from closer down towards the crossing. 5th U.S. was in position up there. And there's actually more artillery with the 6th Corps that we know about that we don't have specific locations on. He's dominated by that artillery fire. He's down in that open ground where we were looking at there. So he has that coming. So the key with why Rhodes there is what were Rhodes' orders and how does he move on his own? Remember, Jubal Early sets this up with his orders to all of his division commanders on the evening of the 18th to have your men sleep on their arms. We know the enemy's nearby. We know he's coming after us. And, so he sets the tone there. And when you have a capable officer like Robert Rhodes, we don't know. Jubal Early may have sent a courier out there and said to attack, but the thing happened so quickly, it seems to me that Rhodes adapted to the situation. Wharton comes up at Early's orders. moves there. Ramseur is actually going to get pulled back over to this side of Berryville as well. So let's head back to the buses.